In the cold, unforgiving expanse of the northern world, the Vikings faced an adversary that would define their survival: the relentless winter. The stark contrast between the warmth of their hearths and the biting chill of the outside world could not have been more pronounced. The frozen tundras, endless nights, and blizzards that blanketed Scandinavia for months on end were not merely obstacles to the Vikings, but an ever-present threat to their existence. Yet, it was precisely in the face of this overwhelming challenge that their ingenuity, resilience, and unyielding spirit shone through. Imagine the icy winds howling through the vast, empty landscapes of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The towering fjords were not beautiful, majestic landmarks. They were harsh barriers to the outside world, cutting off trade routes, travel, and any hope of respite. In these freezing winters, the daylight hours shrank to mere moments, and the sun, when it did appear, cast only a fleeting glimpse of warmth before vanishing behind thick clouds. The cold seeped into every crack and crevice, demanding attention, forcing the Vikings to adapt, innovate, and above all, endure. The Viking winter was a different beast entirely from the cold experienced in more temperate climates. Here, the snow would not simply fall and blanket the earth, it would stay. Thick, immovable layers would form, often accumulating feet deep. This made simple tasks like gathering food, hunting, or even tending to the livestock incredibly difficult. But the Vikings were no strangers to hardship. Their way of life had always been one of resilience. As warriors, they fought battles that took them across seas and lands, but their greatest battle was fought in their own homes, against the cold, the darkness, and the very environment they called home. The Longhouses they built were not mere shelters, but intricate fortresses designed to combat the suffocating cold that could freeze the soul. Every plank of wood, every thatched roof, and every stone used in construction held the weight of their survival. The warmth of the hearth was not a luxury, it was essential. The Vikings knew this better than anyone. The fire at the center of their homes was the thin line between life and death, warmth and frostbite, security and despair. It was here that families gathered, both for survival and for strength, finding solace in the face of an environment that could take everything from them. To understand how they survived these endless winters, one must first grasp the emotional gravity of what it meant to live in such extreme conditions. The Vikings were not merely enduring, they were defying the elements. They were not simply seeking shelter, they were building homes that would keep them safe, connected, and alive in a world that seemed intent on taking it all away. And they did this not by retreating from the cold, but by confronting it head-on, using the tools of nature itself to craft spaces that could endure the harshest of winters. Every aspect of Viking shelter design was a direct response to the challenges they faced. The thickness of the walls, the type of materials used, and the layout of the homes were all carefully considered, with each element designed for efficiency and endurance. The materials, often sourced from the very land around them, wood, turf, stone, and animal hides, became not just building blocks, but symbols of Viking resourcefulness. The very earth beneath their feet was transformed into a shield against the brutal environment. But it wasn't just about the cold. The long winter nights brought their own set of challenges, psychological and emotional. In a world with little light, the darkness could easily turn into a prison. The isolation was not just physical, it was mental and emotional. There were no distractions, no escapes. The long, dark hours forced a kind of introspection, a connection to both the land and each other. In many ways, the shelter they built was more than just a physical structure. It was a space of protection from the darkness that sought to envelop them, a refuge from the cold that threatened to seep into their very hearts. Yet, despite the overwhelming adversity, the Vikings had something no amount of snow, wind, or cold could take away: an unshakable belief in their own strength. The struggle against the northern winters wasn't one they fought alone. It was a battle shared by families, communities, and clans. The Longhouse was more than a shelter. It was the heart of the Viking family, where bonds were formed, stories were told, and survival was secured. It was a space where warmth was shared, both literally and figuratively, providing a sanctuary where their collective strength could grow. In the face of a world that seemed determined to erase them, the Vikings found ways to thrive, to build, to resist. And at the center of this resilience was their shelter, a place of refuge from the cold and a testament to their unyielding will to survive. This was the reality of Viking life, a reality that shaped every decision, every innovation, and every battle they fought. It was a life forged in fire, in the cold, and in the bonds of those who endured together. As we journey through the history of how the Vikings built their shelters to withstand the endless northern winters, we'll uncover not only their architectural genius but also the deeper human spirit that drove them to confront, and ultimately triumph over, the bitterest challenges. Each step in their evolution as builders and survivors tells a story of struggle, determination, and hope. It is a tale of how human ingenuity, when pushed to the limits of endurance, can carve out spaces of survival even in the harshest of environments. The Vikings were not just a people of war and exploration. They were builders, survivors, and innovators. And their greatest achievement was not found on the battlefield or across the seas. It was found in the shelters they created, the homes they built to endure the relentless northern winters. The land the Vikings inhabited was one of extremes. Scandinavia, with its towering mountains, deep fjords, and seemingly endless forests, was a place both beautiful and terrifying. The sheer size and scale of the landscape were intimidating, vast, untouched, and wild. But it was the weather, the climate, and the seasons that truly defined life in this northern realm. For most of the year, the Vikings lived under the shadow of an unforgiving winter. The northern latitudes of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark subjected them to long periods of darkness, where the sun barely crested the horizon. When it did appear, its pale, weak light offered little relief from the biting cold. The winters were not a mere inconvenience. They were a force of nature that could freeze rivers solid, suffocate entire villages under thick blankets of snow, and lock people inside their homes for weeks, even months, at a time. These long winters, with their seemingly endless nights, were not just a backdrop for the Viking struggle. They were an omnipresent challenge that shaped every aspect of their daily lives. The Vikings were not only fighting to survive, but also to adapt to an environment that demanded respect and resilience. To understand the ingenuity behind their shelter building, we must first understand the land they inhabited and the raw, brutal power of nature that surrounded them. Scandinavia's winters were a paradox. The freezing temperatures, which could plummet to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, or even lower, could turn the simplest tasks into life or death struggles. In the north, snow and ice covered the land for much of the year. The ground would be frozen solid for months on end, making it difficult, if not impossible, to grow crops. The sun, when it appeared, barely lingered in the sky. For weeks during the depths of winter, the sun didn't rise at all in the far northern regions. The world was swallowed by darkness, and the long nights seemed to stretch into eternity. In these conditions, every day was a fight against the cold, and every night a battle against the isolation and mental strain of enduring constant darkness. But the Vikings did not retreat from this harsh world. They met it head-on. Despite the bitter cold, their resolve was even stronger. Their resilience wasn't born out of mere necessity, it was part of their identity, woven into the very fabric of their society. They were people defined by their adaptability and resourcefulness. The extreme environment was something they could not control, but they learned to control their response to it. The Viking landscape, with its towering mountains and deep valleys, acted as both a shield and a barrier. The mountains provided some protection from the worst of the winds that roared in from the Arctic, but they also created a sense of isolation, cutting off villages and communities from each other. The fjords, those dramatic, steep-sided valleys filled with water, were stunningly beautiful but also posed significant challenges. During the winter, they could freeze over, trapping people in their homes, preventing trade and travel, and making life even more precarious. For the Vikings, the ever-present threat of winter required constant vigilance. Every season had its own set of challenges. Summer, while short, was an incredibly busy time. The Vikings had to prepare for the long months of winter by gathering food, felling trees, repairing homes, and stockpiling everything they might need. Livestock had to be tended to, crops harvested, and materials for shelter and clothing prepared for the freezing months ahead. There was no time to waste. the seasons were unforgiving, and every task had to be completed before the first frost arrived. The freezing temperatures were not just a physical burden, they were also a constant psychological challenge. The darkness of winter had a profound impact on the Viking psyche. Long nights stretched on, and without the comforting light of the sun to guide them, they had to find other ways to cope with the isolation. In a world where family bonds were everything, the warmth of the longhouse became a sanctuary not just from the cold, but from the mental strain of the endless darkness. But this darkness also had its advantages. It gave rise to the long, intimate nights around the fire, where stories were shared, traditions passed down, and a strong sense of community was forged. To thrive in such an environment required more than just physical strength. It demanded mental fortitude and a deep connection to the land. The Vikings were a people intimately tied to their surroundings. They understood the cycles of the seasons, the movements of the stars, and the rhythms of the earth. They didn't just live in their environment. They interacted with it, respected it, and learned to navigate its most treacherous aspects. Their survival wasn't a matter of chance. It was a product of their knowledge and their ability to work with nature rather than against it. The Vikings' connection to their land was profound, and their shelters were a direct reflection of this relationship. When you look at their longhouses, the structures that served as both homes and fortresses, you can see the careful thought that went into every detail. The walls were thick to keep out the cold, but they were also a part of the natural landscape, made from timber and turf gathered from the surrounding woods and fields. The roofs were thatched to keep the snow from piling up too high, but also to trap warmth inside. The very materials of the shelter were chosen to be in harmony with the land, using the resources available to create something that could endure. In a land where the seasons could be as unpredictable as they were harsh, the Vikings' ability to adapt was their greatest strength. They knew that surviving in such an extreme environment meant constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They were builders, explorers, and survivors, and their success in the face of nature's wrath is a testament to the power of human resilience and innovation. The Vikings' way of life, though defined by the land they inhabited, was shaped by their ability to conquer the challenges presented by that very land. It wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about thriving in spite of it, using every tool at their disposal to create a life that was both meaningful and sustainable. The constant cold and darkness may have surrounded them, but the Vikings had a way of turning that harsh environment into a space where life could continue, relationships could flourish, and their story could be told for generations to come. In the end, the Vikings' world was more than just a physical space. It was a living, breathing testament to their ability to thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. They understood the land as few others did, and in doing so, they transformed it from a place of isolation and hardship into a world that was theirs to conquer. Their story is not just one of warriors and explorers. It is a story of survival, ingenuity, and the triumph of the human spirit over the most extreme of circumstances. To live in the Viking world was to constantly face the threat of extinction. The winter was not just a season, it was an adversary, an ever-present force that demanded both respect and fear. Every year, as the days shortened and the temperatures dropped, the Vikings knew that their survival depended entirely on how well they had prepared for the brutal months ahead. Winter in the north was no mere inconvenience. It was a battle for existence itself. In such a harsh environment, survival was a choice, one that could only be secured through ingenuity, resourcefulness, and an unyielding spirit. The stakes could not have been higher. The cold was a force of nature that had no mercy. Once the snow began to fall and the winds began to howl, the clock started ticking. The longer the winter lasted, the more critical it became to have enough food, firewood, and shelter. Without adequate preparations, the Vikings faced starvation, hypothermia, and death. Even the strong were vulnerable. The darkness of winter had a mental and emotional toll that could wear down even the most hardened warriors. In this environment, there was no middle ground. It was survival or surrender. For the Vikings, every winter was a test of their resilience. The cold was relentless, unyielding. When the first frost arrived, it brought with it a signal that the window of time for preparation had closed. The fragile balance between life and death hinged on how much had been accomplished in the warmer months. With the ground frozen solid and the days of harvesting behind them, there was little that could be done once winter fully gripped the land. Food had to be stored, livestock cared for, and shelter reinforced. Failure in any of these areas meant that death would come sooner rather than later. The physical toll of the cold was immense. The freezing temperatures could cause frostbite in mere minutes, and hypothermia was always a looming threat for anyone who ventured outside without the proper gear. Even within the relative safety of their homes, the cold could creep in, threatening to extinguish the warmth of the hearth and freeze the blood in one's veins. To make matters worse, the northern nights seemed endless, stretching out to weeks or months without daylight. This unrelenting darkness could strain even the most optimistic souls, and the isolation it brought could take a psychological toll that was just as deadly as the physical cold. It wasn't just the environment that posed a threat. The Vikings were also at the mercy of the animals and resources around them. The land that had once provided abundance during the summer months now offered little in terms of sustenance. The forest might have been a haven of wood in the warmer seasons, but the snow-covered landscape made it nearly impossible to hunt, fish, or gather food. Livestock, though valuable, required constant care, and there was always the risk of losing animals to the harsh conditions. With the land blanketed in snow, hunting was made all the more difficult. The rivers and lakes froze over, and many of the food sources that the Vikings had relied on during the warmer months were now inaccessible. They were dependent on what they had stored, and any shortages could spell disaster. But beyond the threat of food shortages and the bitter cold, there was the ever-present specter of isolation. During the depths of winter, when the world outside their homes was covered in snow, the Vikings often found themselves cut off from the rest of the world. The Longhouse, the heart of Viking society, was not just a shelter, it was a sanctuary. Within its walls, they could find warmth, companionship, and protection from the storm outside. Yet even here, they were vulnerable. In the darkness, with little light to guide them, fear could easily take hold. The long hours of isolation made time seem to stretch endlessly, and the mental strain could weigh heavily on those who lived through the long winters. In this environment, every decision mattered. The Vikings' ability to endure the winter came down to careful preparation, planning, and a deep understanding of their environment. Those who were unprepared for the coming cold could find themselves at the mercy of the elements. But for those who had planned ahead, there was hope. They could survive the winter, live to see the spring, and continue their way of life. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about finding ways to endure, to find joy and meaning even in the harshest of conditions. This constant threat of extinction defined the Viking way of life. It shaped their culture, their values, and their very identity. Every aspect of Viking life was influenced by the cold. The way they built their homes, the way they stored food, and the way they formed communities, all of it was a direct response to the harsh winter conditions. They didn't just build shelters to protect themselves from the cold, they built them to endure it, to resist it, to hold back the tide of ice and snow that threatened to swallow them whole. The Viking response to the winter was more than just a matter of physical survival. It was a matter of identity. The Vikings were not content to simply survive. They wanted to thrive, to build, to conquer. They were a people defined by their ability to endure hardship, and the winter was the ultimate test of that endurance. In a land where the cold could kill without mercy, the Vikings developed a fierce will to live, to carve out a place for themselves in the world. They were not passive victims of the cold. They were active participants in their own survival, using every tool at their disposal to fight back against the elements. The importance of survival cannot be overstated. For the Vikings, survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant continuing their way of life, preserving their culture, and ensuring the future of their people. The long winter nights were a time for reflection, for bonding with family and community, but they were also a time to plan for the future. The strength of the Viking people was in their ability to adapt, to make the most of the resources they had, and to survive not just for the sake of survival, but for the sake of the generations to come. As the long winter began to settle in, the Vikings knew that every choice they made would have consequences. The shelters they built were not just places to sleep, they were fortresses of survival, spaces designed to keep them safe from the harshest of elements. The warmth of the hearth, the thick walls of the longhouse, and the carefully stored food were all part of a larger strategy to weather the storm. And for the Vikings, this was not just about survival. It was a declaration of defiance against the cold, against nature, and against the forces that sought to destroy them. In the end, survival was not a guarantee. It was a fight. And it was a fight that the Vikings fought every single winter. They understood that the cold was not something to be feared, but something to be conquered. They didn't just survive the winter. They learned to live with it, to thrive in spite of it, and to emerge victorious when spring finally arrived. The Viking longhouse was more than just a shelter. It was the very heart of Viking society. In a land where survival was uncertain, where each winter threatened to erase everything, the longhouse stood as a symbol of resilience, strength, and community. It was not merely a place to sleep, it was a sanctuary, a fortress against the harsh elements, and a reflection of the Viking way of life. The longhouse was central to the Viking world, and its design was a direct response to the challenges of living in such an extreme environment. The longhouse was designed to withstand the brutal northern winters, and every detail of its construction was carefully considered. The shape of the house itself was long and narrow, with a steep roof that allowed snow to slide off easily, preventing the weight of accumulated snow from collapsing the structure. The roof was thatched with straw or sod, materials that helped insulate the house and retain warmth. The walls were made of thick wood, often logs stacked on top of one another, with gaps filled in with moss or animal hair to help keep the warmth inside. The very materials used to build the house were drawn from the land around them, wood from the surrounding forests, turf from the earth, and stone from the riverbeds. Each material was chosen for its practicality and ability to endure the harsh conditions. Inside, the longhouse was a warm and bustling space. At the heart of every Viking longhouse was the hearth, the central source of heat and light. This fire was more than just a tool for cooking, it was the lifeblood of the house. The hearth was a gathering place, a spot where families would sit together, share stories, and bond over meals. It was the symbol of warmth in a world of cold, a reminder that, no matter how harsh the outside world became, there was always a place inside the longhouse where warmth and security could be found. The layout of the longhouse reflected the social structure of Viking society. The longhouse was designed to house an extended family, often several generations living under one roof. The large central area was the shared space, where the hearth was located, and where people would gather to eat, talk, and sleep. Along the walls were smaller sections for individual families or groups of people. The floor was typically covered with straw or animal pelts to provide insulation from the cold ground, and the walls were lined with shelves and racks for storing tools, food, and other necessities. The longhouse was built to be both a communal space and a personal refuge, where the bonds of family and community were strengthened. But the longhouse was not just a place for humans, it was also a place for animals. In many Viking homes, animals were kept inside the longhouse during the winter months. This was not merely for convenience, it was a matter of survival. The cold was so extreme that even the livestock needed protection. Cows, sheep, and pigs would share the warmth of the longhouse, huddling together for warmth, while their owners slept and worked in the same space. This was not just a practical measure, it was also a reflection of the interconnectedness of Viking life. The Vikings understood that survival was a collective effort, and that the strength of the family and the community was essential to weathering the harshest of conditions. The Viking longhouse was also designed for defense. In a world where raids, invasions, and attacks were constant threats, security was of utmost importance. The longhouse was built to withstand the elements, but it was also built to withstand attacks. The thick walls and low doorways made it difficult for enemies to break in, and the longhouse's shape allowed the inhabitants to quickly barricade themselves inside. The layout was simple but effective. There were no windows on the lower level, and the door was small and narrow, making it difficult for anyone to enter without being noticed. It was a fortress, not just against the cold, but against any external threat that might come their way. The Viking longhouse was a reflection of the Viking philosophy, survival through strength, unity, and adaptability. Every aspect of its design was a response to the challenges of living in such a hostile environment. The structure was built to withstand the cold, the wind, and the snow, but it was also built to provide warmth, security, and a sense of community. The Vikings knew that to survive the long, dark winters, they would need more than just physical shelter. They would need a place that would bring them together, a place that would offer them strength and solace in the face of adversity. The Longhouse was also a space for creativity and innovation. As the Vikings faced new challenges, they adapted their homes to meet their needs. The hearth, for example, was not just a place to cook, it was a multifunctional space, where people could gather, rest, and even work. The warmth of the fire was crucial to the survival of the inhabitants, but it also provided a sense of comfort, a psychological refuge from the cold and darkness outside. The Vikings understood that their survival was not just about the physical aspects of their environment, it was about how they created spaces that supported their well-being and sense of community. In a world where the cold could kill, the Viking longhouse was a symbol of defiance. It was a testament to the Viking ability to adapt, to find strength in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a space that provided warmth, protection, and security, but it was also a space that allowed for life to continue, despite the bitter cold, despite the isolation, despite the darkness. The Longhouse was a place where life could flourish, where stories could be told, and where the bonds of family and community could be strengthened. In a land where survival was never guaranteed, the Longhouse was both a refuge and a foundation, a place that grounded the Vikings in the midst of a harsh and unforgiving world. As much as the Longhouse was a physical structure, it was also a psychological one. It represented the heart of Viking society, a place where the struggles of the outside world could be momentarily forgotten, where people could find warmth, comfort, and a sense of belonging. It was a space where the Vikings could look past the harshness of the environment and focus on the strength of the community. It was not just a shelter from the cold. It was a shelter from despair, a place where hope could survive even in the darkest of winters. The Viking Longhouse, then, was more than just a building. It was the center of life, the foundation of Viking society, and a symbol of the Viking spirit, a spirit that refused to yield to the cold, the darkness, and the relentless demands of the natural world. It was a testament to the resilience of the human will, to the ingenuity of a people who had learned not just to survive, but to thrive in the face of the harshest conditions imaginable. The Viking Longhouse was, in every sense, a foundation of strength. The Vikings were master builders, not just of ships and weapons, but of homes that could withstand the extreme conditions of the northern world. Their ability to adapt to their environment was evident in the materials they chose and the architectural solutions they developed to endure the bitter cold, howling winds, and endless winters. In a land where nature often seemed intent on destroying what little humans could create, the Vikings learned to harness the power of the very earth beneath their feet, shaping it into structures that were as resilient as the people who lived in them. At the heart of Viking architecture was the Longhouse, the quintessential shelter of the Viking people. But the materials that went into these homes were just as important as the design itself. In the unforgiving northern landscape, where wood was scarce in some areas and other resources were difficult to come by, the Vikings had to make use of everything around them. It was a matter of necessity, but also a matter of survival. Every piece of material used in construction had to serve a practical purpose, and each choice reflected the ingenuity that became the hallmark of Viking civilization. Wood was the primary building material for Viking homes, particularly in forested areas where it was abundant. Trees, especially pine and oak, provided not only the timber for the walls but also the framing for the roofs. These trees were felled with careful precision and then shaped into beams and planks that would form the skeleton of the longhouse. The wood was durable, providing a strong foundation for the shelter. But just using wood was not enough. The Vikings knew that it had to be treated in ways that would make it resistant to decay, which could quickly destroy a building in the damp northern climate. To make the wood last, the Vikings would often treat it with pitch, a sticky substance derived from trees. This pitch would be used to seal cracks and prevent water from seeping into the wood, which would eventually lead to rot. It also served to waterproof the roof, ensuring that the longhouse could withstand the relentless rain and snow that was common in Scandinavia. In this way, the Vikings displayed an extraordinary understanding of the materials they worked with and the environment they were trying to conquer. But wood alone was not enough to keep out the cold. The Vikings also relied on other materials to insulate their homes and ensure that heat from the hearth would not escape. One of the most important of these materials was turf or sod. In the more barren parts of Scandinavia, where trees were few and far between, turf became a vital resource for construction. Layers of sod were used to build the walls of the longhouse, stacked carefully to create an insulating barrier against the bitter wind. The grass and soil, thick with moisture, acted as an excellent insulator, trapping heat inside and keeping the cold out. In addition to turf, the Vikings also used animal hides in their construction. These hides, often from cows, reindeer, or other animals, were stretched over wooden frames or used as insulation between layers of sod and timber. They provided an extra layer of protection from the cold and served as a reminder of the Vikings' deep connection to the land and the animals they hunted. These hides, which were often treated and preserved with natural oils, helped to further seal the house from the elements, creating a warm and protected space for the inhabitants. But the ingenuity of Viking architecture was not limited to the materials they used. It extended to the design of the longhouse itself. The longhouse was typically a large, rectangular structure with a steep roof, designed specifically to shed snow and withstand the heavy weight of winter storms. The shape of the roof was not just a matter of aesthetics, it was a practical solution to a very real problem. The heavy snowfalls of the Viking world could easily collapse a roof that was too flat, so the steeply pitched roofs allowed the snow to slide off naturally, reducing the risk of structural damage. The roofs of Viking homes were often thatched with straw or covered with sod. These materials helped to insulate the house and provided a layer of protection against the wind. The use of thatch was particularly effective, as it could be easily replaced or repaired if damaged by the elements. It was also a material that blended seamlessly into the surrounding environment, making the longhouse less conspicuous and more in harmony with the natural landscape. Inside the longhouse, the Vikings used every bit of space to its fullest potential. The central hearth, which was the focal point of the house, was designed to be as efficient as possible, drawing heat from the fire and distributing it throughout the home. The fire itself was not just a source of warmth, it was the heart of the Viking household, where food was cooked, light was provided, and stories were told. The chimney, often made from stone, allowed the smoke to escape while keeping the warmth inside. The ventilation was crucial in ensuring that the air inside the longhouse remained breathable and that the fire could burn cleanly. The interior of the longhouse was also carefully planned to maximize space. The Vikings often slept on raised platforms or along the walls, with the central area of the house left open for cooking, working, and socializing. The interior walls were often covered with tapestries, hides, and other textiles, which served not only as insulation but also as decoration, adding warmth and color to the otherwise simple space. Every element of the longhouse was designed with practicality in mind, but also with an eye toward comfort and efficiency. Viking builders didn't just rely on materials and design to survive the winter, they also employed clever engineering techniques to ensure that their homes could endure. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking architecture was its ability to withstand the constant stress of the weather. The combination of thick walls, steep roofs, and carefully designed interiors made the longhouse a fortress against the cold. But the Vikings also understood that their homes had to be flexible, able to adapt to the changing seasons. The longhouses were constructed with materials that allowed for expansion and contraction, which helped them to avoid the damage that could occur when wood swells or contracts in response to changes in temperature and humidity. The Vikings' ability to use what was available to them, from the trees and sod of the land to the hides of the animals they hunted, was a testament to their resourcefulness. They didn't just survive in the cold, they thrived in it. Their homes were more than just shelters. They were the result of centuries of trial and error, of learning how to use the land and the materials around them to create a safe, warm environment. The Viking longhouse was a symbol of their strength, adaptability, and deep understanding of the world they lived in. The materials the Vikings used were not just functional, they were also a reflection of their relationship with the land. The wood, the turf, the hides, and the stone all came from nature, and each one was used with great respect and care. The Viking approach to building was one of sustainability, using what the land provided in the most efficient and respectful way possible. This deep connection to the environment is what allowed the Vikings to survive in such a harsh and unforgiving world. In the end, the Viking longhouse was more than just a physical structure. It was a testament to the ingenuity, creativity, and adaptability of the Viking people. It was a space where they could not only survive, but thrive, even in the face of the harshest winters. And through their innovative use of materials and design, they created a legacy that would endure for centuries, leaving behind a lasting mark on the history of architecture and human survival. In the Viking longhouse, the hearth was much more than just a source of heat. It was the very heart of the home, both physically and metaphorically. In a world where the cold could kill, where the darkness could suffocate hope, the hearth provided not only warmth but light, nourishment, and a sense of community. It was where the family gathered, where meals were prepared, and where stories were shared. The hearth was a symbol of life itself, vital, sustaining, and central to the survival of the Viking people. The hearth was typically situated at the center of the longhouse, in the most strategic location possible, so that its warmth could be felt throughout the structure. In many homes, the hearth would be built with a stone base to prevent the fire from damaging the wooden floor. The fire itself was usually a simple open flame, with a stone or metal frame to hold the burning logs and keep the fire contained. The smoke would rise up through a chimney or a flue, which was crucial to prevent the house from becoming filled with smoke. But more than just being a physical feature of the home, the hearth served as the very lifeblood of Viking life. For the Vikings, fire was sacred. It represented both destruction and renewal, warmth and death, life and survival. The hearth was the first thing the Vikings would build when settling a new location. It was the symbol of their mastery over the elements, their ability to turn the raw materials of the land into something that could provide comfort and sustenance. Without fire, the longhouse would have been little more than a cold shell, unable to protect its inhabitants from the dangers of the winter. The hearth was the one constant around which everything else revolved. It gave warmth, light, and a sense of purpose to the family. The Viking hearth was more than just a tool for survival. It was a social space. In the warmth of the firelight, the family would gather after a long day of work, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. It was around the hearth that the bonds of family were strengthened and the traditions of the Vikings were passed down from one generation to the next. The hearth was the center of Viking society, not just a place for cooking, but a place for community. It was where decisions were made, where disputes were settled, and where future plans were laid. The flames of the hearth symbolized the energy of the household, the strength and resilience of the family, and the warmth of shared experience. Cooking at the hearth was a communal activity. The Vikings had simple but effective cooking methods, utilizing the direct heat of the fire to roast, boil, or bake food. The central hearth was often large enough to accommodate a pot or cauldron, which would be hung over the fire, its contents simmering away in the warmth. Meat, vegetables, and grains would be cooked together in a hearty stew, a staple of the Viking diet. The smell of food wafting through the longhouse was not just an indicator of nourishment, it was a signal of life, of survival in a harsh world. The hearth was also used for warmth during the long, cold winters. In the absence of modern heating, the fire was the only means of keeping warm. In a time before electricity or central heating, the hearth was the only source of heat within the longhouse, and without it, the family would have had little protection against the bitter cold. As the fire burned, its warmth spread throughout the house, keeping the inhabitants safe from frostbite and hypothermia. In a world where the temperature could dip below freezing for months on end, the hearth was a vital tool for survival, and the family's ability to keep the fire burning was a matter of life or death. Beyond its practical uses, the hearth also had a spiritual and cultural significance. For the Vikings, fire was a sacred element, closely linked to their gods. The hearth was often seen as the domain of the goddess of the home, Frigg, whose presence was invoked during rituals to protect the family and ensure the prosperity of the household. Offerings of food and drink were sometimes made to honor the hearth, and the family would celebrate the turning of the seasons with feasts and ceremonies around the fire. The hearth was the focal point of Viking religious and cultural life, where the gods were honored and the strength of the family was reinforced. The hearth was also a tool for crafting and creating. In addition to cooking, The Vikings used the fire for tasks like forging weapons, tanning hides, and preparing food for preservation. The heat from the hearth was used to shape metal, turning raw ore into tools, weapons, and ornaments. The hearth was a place where skill was honed, where craftsmanship was perfected, and where the tools of survival were made. The fire provided the energy needed to carry out these tasks, and the products of the hearth were as essential to the Viking way of life as the food they consumed. Even the simple act of maintaining the hearth required great care. The Vikings had to gather firewood, split it, and store it for the cold months ahead. The hearth would need to be carefully tended to, ensuring that the fire burned steadily and did not go out. Every night, the hearth would be relit, its flames flickering to life again, a symbol of the family's perseverance and resilience. The act of tending to the fire became almost ritualistic, a daily task that brought the family together and kept the home warm, safe, and alive. The hearth also played an important role in Viking social rituals. It was around the fire that the leaders of the community would often gather with their followers, making important decisions and setting the course for the future. The warmth of the fire created a space for open dialogue and collaboration, where ideas could be exchanged and plans could be made. The hearth was where the community came together, and in many ways, it was the lifeblood of Viking society, a place where people could share not just their food, but their hopes, dreams, and stories. In the long winters, when the world outside was dark and cold, the hearth became even more important. It was a place of comfort and reassurance, a place where the family could gather, talk, and seek warmth. The hearth kept the darkness at bay, both physically and emotionally. In a time when the outside world could be cruel and unforgiving, the hearth offered a sense of safety and security. It was a reminder that, no matter how harsh the world outside, there was always warmth, light, and life within the walls of the longhouse. The hearth was a symbol of Viking resilience, ingenuity, and community. It was the foundation upon which the entire structure of Viking life was built. It was the center of the home, the source of warmth and sustenance, and the place where families and communities came together to survive, thrive, and grow. The hearth was not just a tool, it was a lifeline. Without it, the Vikings could not have withstood the bitter cold and the long, dark winters. The hearth was, quite simply, the heart of the Viking home, and it burned brightly, day after day, year after year, keeping the spirit of the Viking people alive. Viking shelters were designed not only to withstand the elements but also to offer protection from dangers beyond the cold. The Viking longhouse, as a central feature of their homesteads, was built with an understanding that survival in the harsh northern landscapes required more than just warmth and comfort. It demanded defense against a multitude of threats. In an era when invasions and raids were frequent, Viking homes had to be fortified to withstand attacks, making the longhouse a sanctuary against more than just nature's harshest forces. To live in the Viking Age meant being constantly aware of threats, both from the unpredictable natural world and from human enemies. As formidable as they were as warriors, Vikings also had to be vigilant in defending their homes and families. The construction of the longhouse reflected this need for protection, with design features that offered both security and survival strategies. The longhouse wasn't just a place to rest, it was a fortress where families could retreat in times of danger, where they could hold off attacks long enough to wait for reinforcements or find a means of escape. The first line of defense in a Viking home was the very structure of the longhouse itself. The walls were thick and robust, typically made of timber or turf, materials chosen not only for their insulating properties but also for their strength. The heavy timbers provided a physical barrier, resistant to being easily breached. In a time when axes, spears, and swords were the tools of warfare, the thick wood of the longhouse was a formidable obstacle for anyone trying to break in. In many cases, Viking homes were built with low, narrow doorways, making it difficult for attackers to enter without being noticed. These doorways were often heavily reinforced and could be barred from the inside, providing another layer of security against unwanted guests. In addition to the thick walls and fortified entrances, the longhouse was often strategically located to take advantage of natural defenses. Vikings were keenly aware of their surroundings, and they often built their homes on elevated ground or near bodies of water, making it difficult for enemies to approach unnoticed. A settlement near a cliffside or a fjord, for example, provided natural barriers against enemy forces, while a location with a clear view of the surrounding landscape allowed the Vikings to spot approaching danger long before it arrived at their door. The Viking longhouse was also designed with defensive features in mind. The steep, sloped roof, which was essential for shedding snow and rain, also made it difficult for attackers to gain easy access to the building. A roof that angled sharply downwards provided fewer footholds and less opportunity for climbing, making it harder for enemies to infiltrate the shelter from above. The slanted roof was another example of Viking ingenuity. What appeared to be a simple design choice for weather resistance also served the practical purpose of adding security against potential attacks. But the defense didn't end with the walls and roof. The Viking family had learned over generations that to survive in a land filled with both natural dangers and human threats, they had to rely on each other and on the shared responsibility of safeguarding their home. A family's bond was forged through shared defense and collective effort, and the longhouse reflected this communal aspect. The Vikings often lived in tight-knit communities where everyone was expected to play a role in defense. When danger loomed, the hearth of the longhouse became the rallying point. Everyone, from the elderly to the young, would take shelter and prepare for whatever might come, whether it was an enemy raid, an animal attack, or a fierce storm. The hearth, as the center of the home, also became the heart of the defense, its fire and warmth providing a sense of security during moments of fear. In addition to these physical fortifications, the Viking longhouse was also designed to be a place of strategic organization during times of crisis. When Viking families gathered inside their longhouses during moments of danger, it wasn't just about physical protection, it was also about maintaining order, focus, and unity. The shared space allowed for rapid decision-making and a coordinated response to any threat. In times of peace, the longhouse was a place of relaxation and communal life. In times of danger, it became a hub of action, a space where plans could be made, weapons could be prepared, and strategies could be devised. In terms of weaponry, Vikings were well equipped for self-defense. Axes, swords, and shields were always within reach, and many homes had dedicated storage areas where these tools were kept ready for use. The longhouse wasn't just a place to keep tools, it was a place to prepare for battle. Weapons were stored near the hearth, ready to be grabbed at a moment's notice. Many Viking families would also keep additional weapons and armor tucked away in storage spaces along the walls. The very architecture of the longhouse, with its open design and abundant storage, allowed for quick access to these items, making it easier for Vikings to defend themselves. Furthermore, the Viking family knew how to fortify their defenses in other ways. When under threat, the community would work together to shore up the defenses of their homes. Doors would be barred and windows covered. The fire from the hearth could be used not only for warmth but also to create a barrier of heat and light around the home. In the dark, hostile nights of the Viking world, a blazing fire could serve as both a psychological deterrent and a physical safeguard. The smoke rising from the chimney could make it difficult for enemies to approach unnoticed, and the light from the flames illuminated the surroundings, revealing any movement in the night. During Viking raids, the importance of shelter as a refuge for families was even more evident. The longhouse was often the first place people ran to when an attack occurred. This was particularly true during the Viking Age when raids were commonplace. During these times, the longhouse acted as a sanctuary, a place to flee from the chaos of battle, a safe zone where the elderly, women, and children could find shelter while the warriors defended the settlement. The defensive features of the longhouse, combined with the solidarity of the community, were vital to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. The concept of the Viking home as a fortress extended beyond individual homes. In larger settlements, such as Viking villages or fortified strongholds, the homes were often grouped together to create a defensive perimeter. This communal structure allowed for easier protection of the entire settlement. The homes would be arranged in such a way that each longhouse could offer support to the others, creating a fortified enclave where families could seek refuge if danger arrived. Watchtowers, fortifications, and palisades would further reinforce these communities, adding extra layers of protection to Viking life. Viking homes were therefore much more than simple shelters from the cold. They were symbols of strength, resilience, and collective survival. Each longhouse, with its thick walls and strategic location, served as both a personal haven and a communal fortress. It was the center of life, a place of warmth, security, and defense, all wrapped into one. As much as the Vikings relied on their physical fortifications, their true strength lay in the spirit of cooperation and unity that the longhouse represented. For the Viking people, their shelters were far more than just places to sleep. They were the first line of defense, the places where the bond between family, community, and survival was forged. The Viking longhouse, solid in its design and strong in its purpose, was a true shield, protecting those within it from both the cold and the chaos of the world beyond. The transition from the long, sunlit days of summer to the endless nights of winter marked a profound shift for the Viking people. In the far northern latitudes, the length of daylight varied drastically throughout the year. While summer brought weeks of almost continuous daylight, the winter months were shrouded in darkness. For many, the long winter nights were not just a period of cold but also of isolation, both physically and mentally. The Vikings, however, were a people defined by their resilience and ability to adapt. They met the long nights of winter with a combination of resourcefulness, community, and the comforting routine of the longhouse. The most striking feature of the Viking winter was the darkness. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, it seemed as though daylight would never return. In the far reaches of Scandinavia, certain parts of the year saw days where the sun barely crested the horizon, casting the world into twilight for weeks at a time. For the Vikings, this absence of sunlight was more than just a natural occurrence. It was a stark reminder of the harshness of the environment. The cold of winter was not just physical, it also had a psychological toll, as the lack of sunlight often led to feelings of confinement and melancholy. But the Vikings, accustomed to the cyclical nature of the seasons, had learned to adjust and find meaning in this darkness. One of the ways in which the Vikings adapted to the darkness was through their deep reliance on the hearth. The hearth, located at the center of every longhouse, became a symbol of light in the overwhelming darkness. It was where the warmth of fire and the flicker of flames illuminated the otherwise dim interior of the house. During the long winter nights, the hearth not only provided physical warmth but also served as a source of psychological comfort. The fire represented the endurance of life, a vital force that burned even in the harshest conditions. The flickering light from the hearth became a small but powerful beacon in an otherwise cold and dark world. It drew families together, offering a space where they could seek refuge from the overwhelming night and share the warmth of both fire and company. Within the longhouse, life was organized around the hearth, which became a focal point for many aspects of Viking life during the winter. It was where families gathered, where food was prepared, and where stories were told. During the long winter nights, the hearth was the setting for the Viking tradition of oral storytelling, where tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors were passed down from one generation to the next. These stories became more than just entertainment. They were a way of making sense of the dark, of imbuing the cold and isolation with meaning and purpose. The hearth became a place where the warmth of community and the light of stories fought back against the cold and darkness outside. For the Vikings, the long winter nights were a time for reflection and introspection. The isolation of winter, with its dark and cold stretches of time, meant that the community huddled together for warmth, both physically and emotionally. The longhouse became a sanctuary not only from the cold but also from the sense of isolation that the long, dark nights could bring. It was a place where the bonds of family and community were solidified. The harshness of winter demanded that the Vikings come together, work together, and rely on each other for warmth, both literal and figurative. This sense of shared responsibility and reliance on one another was key to Viking survival. In the darkest of nights, the Vikings were never truly alone. The community was always there, gathered around the hearth, ready to support one another. While the nights were long, the Vikings found ways to make them productive. The dark months of winter were not only a time for rest and reflection but also a time for preparation. With outdoor tasks impossible due to the cold and snow, the Vikings turned inward. Inside the longhouse, tasks such as weaving, tool-making, and leatherworking were carried out in the glow of the hearth. This was also a time for repairing weapons and crafting new tools for the coming seasons. In a society where readiness was essential for survival, the winter nights provided the necessary downtime to maintain and prepare for the future. The Vikings understood that the winter was a time for action, even if that action was more about preparing than fighting or raiding. In addition to these practical tasks, the winter months were a time for spiritual and cultural reflection. The absence of sunlight meant that the Vikings were more attuned to the rhythms of nature, the turning of the seasons, and the gods that guided their world. The long, dark nights were a time for the Vikings to connect with their spiritual beliefs, to honor the gods, and to participate in rituals that would ensure the prosperity and protection of their families and communities. The darkness of winter, in this sense, became a time of spiritual renewal. The Vikings understood that the darkness and cold of winter were not only external challenges but also internal ones. To endure the long nights, they had to nurture their spirits and their resolve. During this time, the Vikings would hold feasts and ceremonies around the hearth, often in honor of their gods. These rituals were not only acts of worship but also expressions of community and solidarity. They believed that the gods needed to be honored, especially during the harsh winter months, to ensure that the coming year would bring prosperity and good fortune. These gatherings were filled with feasting, music, and dancing, all of which helped to keep spirits high during the long, dark nights. The communal nature of these gatherings strengthened the social fabric of Viking society, reinforcing the importance of solidarity during difficult times. The winter nights were also a time for the Vikings to prepare for the coming of spring. While the days were short and the nights long, the Vikings knew that the seasons would eventually change. The darkness, though oppressive, was not permanent. It was simply a part of the natural cycle. As the Vikings sat together around the hearth, they would talk about the future, about the spring harvest, the coming of the light, and the opportunities that the new season would bring. These conversations helped to keep hope alive during the darkest days of winter, reminding the Vikings that the long nights were not forever. The cycles of nature would continue, and with them, the promise of warmth, light, and renewal. As the long winter nights slowly began to fade and the first signs of spring began to appear, the Vikings emerged from their longhouses, ready to face the world once more. The dark months had not broken them. Rather, they had reinforced the bonds of family and community. The hearth, which had burned brightly throughout the coldest months, now symbolized not just warmth and survival, but the endurance of the Viking spirit. It was a reminder that, no matter how long the darkness lasted, the light would always return. In the end, the long winter nights were more than just a physical challenge for the Vikings. They were a test of mental and emotional resilience. The darkness, though daunting, was a time when the Vikings demonstrated their ability to endure, adapt, and find meaning in the face of adversity. And just as they had learned to survive the cold, the isolation, and the darkness, they knew they would emerge stronger, united, and ready for the challenges that the new season would bring. Viking society was built on the foundation of practicality and necessity, and this philosophy permeated every aspect of their daily lives, including their approach to building and shelter. Viking ingenuity in shelter design was not just about surviving the elements. It was about creating structures that would endure the harsh northern climate for generations. The Vikings were not only skilled warriors and sailors, they were also master builders, drawing on centuries of knowledge to design shelters that balanced strength, functionality, and resilience. At the heart of Viking shelter design was the longhouse, a building type that became synonymous with Viking living. The longhouse was more than just a home. It was a cultural and social hub, a microcosm of Viking society itself. These longhouses were designed to serve multiple functions, housing not only the family but also livestock, tools, and provisions. The design of the longhouse reflected the Vikings' understanding of the challenges posed by the environment they lived in and their ability to turn those challenges into opportunities. One of the most notable aspects of Viking shelter construction was their use of local materials. The Vikings were not wasteful people. They used what was readily available in their environment, ensuring that their homes were both sustainable and effective. Timber, turf, and stone were the primary materials used in the construction of longhouses. Wood was plentiful in the forests of Scandinavia, and it was used for the structure of the house, both the walls and the roof. In areas where wood was scarce, the Vikings turned to turf and sod, which they used to build walls and roofs that provided excellent insulation against the cold. These materials were not just chosen for their abundance. They were selected because of their ability to protect against the elements and to help maintain warmth inside the home during the brutal winters. The Viking longhouse was designed with an understanding of the harsh climate. The steep, sloping roof was one of the most important features of the house, designed to shed snow and prevent it from accumulating on top of the building. The weight of snow could cause a flat roof to collapse under the pressure, so the Vikings designed roofs that were pitched at a steep angle, allowing the snow to slide off naturally. This design was not only practical but also a testament to the Vikings' ability to think ahead and adapt their shelter to their environment. The thatched or sod-covered roofs were insulated against the cold and provided an additional layer of protection from the wind and rain. Inside the longhouse, the layout was just as carefully planned. The Vikings understood that space was precious, especially in the winter months when they would be confined to the longhouse for weeks at a time. The central hearth, which provided warmth and light, was located in the middle of the longhouse, surrounded by benches or raised platforms where the family would sleep. The layout of the longhouse was designed to maximize the use of space while ensuring that heat from the hearth could circulate throughout the building. The Vikings also made efficient use of vertical space, with shelves and racks lining the walls for storing tools, weapons, and provisions. The longhouse was often divided into sections, with the family living in one area, while livestock was kept in another. This shared space reflected the Vikings' understanding of the interdependence between people and animals. The livestock provided warmth, as the animals' body heat contributed to the overall temperature inside the longhouse. This close relationship with animals was essential for survival in the harsh winters, as the Vikings relied on their animals not only for food but also for companionship and warmth. Another key element of Viking shelter construction was the importance of defense. Viking homes were not just designed to keep out the cold, they were built to protect the inhabitants from raids and attacks. The Vikings lived in a world of constant threats, both from nature and from other tribes or invaders. As a result, their homes were built with defensive features in mind. Thick walls made from timber or stone provided a strong barrier against both the cold and potential intruders. The roofs, with their steep pitches and reinforced frames, were difficult to scale, adding an additional layer of security. The narrow, low doorways of the longhouse made it harder for enemies to enter, and the layout of the house allowed for quick fortification in times of attack. The Vikings' approach to shelter construction was also highly adaptable. They were not tied to a single style or design but instead adapted their homes based on the resources available and the specific needs of the community. In coastal areas, for example, Viking homes were often built with more durable materials, such as stone and driftwood, that could withstand the salty air and constant exposure to moisture. In more forested areas, timber was the primary material, allowing for faster and more efficient construction. The Vikings were also skilled at adapting their homes to different seasonal conditions, creating structures that could be easily modified depending on the time of year. In the summer, the roof might be temporarily removed to allow for better ventilation, while in the winter, it would be sealed to keep out the cold. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking shelter design was their ability to create structures that were not only functional but also aesthetically pleasing. The longhouses were often decorated with intricate carvings and artwork, reflecting the Vikings' love of beauty and craftsmanship. The carvings on the doors, beams, and walls often depicted scenes from Viking mythology or everyday life, adding a sense of artistry to the otherwise utilitarian space. These carvings were not just decorative, they told stories, recorded history, and preserved the cultural heritage of the Vikings. The Vikings' ability to craft such durable and effective shelters was a direct result of their deep understanding of their environment and their resourcefulness. They were able to take the materials at hand, wood, stone, turf, and animal hides, and combine them in ways that allowed them to survive and thrive in one of the most inhospitable climates on Earth. The longhouse was a testament to Viking ingenuity, blending practical design with a deep respect for nature and a strong sense of community. The Viking longhouse was also a symbol of the strength of Viking society. It represented the unity of the family and the importance of collective effort. Building a longhouse was a communal task, and the construction of each home brought people together. The building process itself was a reflection of Viking values, hard work, cooperation, and perseverance. Each longhouse was not just a shelter but a reflection of the community that built it. It was a place where families could weather the cold and the darkness, and where generations could come together to preserve the legacy of their ancestors. As Viking society expanded and their settlements grew, their shelters became more sophisticated, but the principles behind their construction remained the same. The longhouse was the heart of Viking life, and its design and construction were a testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and unity of the Viking people. The legacy of these shelters lives on today, not only in the archaeological remains of Viking settlements but also in the lessons they offer about adaptability, community, and survival. Viking homes were not merely structures designed for shelter from the elements. They were symbols of resilience, culture, and identity. The longhouse, with its sturdy frame and functional design, was a reflection of the Viking way of life, tough, adaptive, and deeply connected to the land and community. In a world where survival often depended on the harshest of conditions, these homes served as not just protection from the cold and the dark, but also as enduring symbols of the Viking spirit and their ability to thrive in a world that could be unforgiving. At the heart of Viking society was the family, and the longhouse was a physical manifestation of the family's importance. It was the center of daily life, a space where generations lived and worked together in a shared environment. The family unit was more than just a social construct. It was the bedrock of Viking survival. The Viking longhouse, therefore, was not just a home in the traditional sense, it was the embodiment of the familial bonds that held society together. Each longhouse was built with a deep understanding of the needs of those who would live inside it, providing warmth, safety, and a sense of security for all members of the household. Within the walls of the longhouse, Viking families carried out their daily routines, from cooking and eating to storytelling and socializing. The hearth was the centerpiece of the home, and it was where families gathered, not just for warmth but for connection. The fire in the hearth was a symbol of life, providing light and heat, and acting as a focal point for the most important aspects of Viking culture. The act of sitting around the hearth, eating together, and sharing stories was integral to the Viking identity. The hearth was not just a place for physical warmth, it was a space where the warmth of family, tradition, and culture flourished. The longhouse itself was a powerful symbol of Viking resilience. It was a structure built to endure the harshest of winters, designed to withstand the biting cold, howling winds, and constant snowfall. The thick walls, steep roofs, and insulating materials, such as sod and animal hides, were all chosen with survival in mind. Yet, the longhouse was not just a place of shelter. It was also a space for the Vikings to showcase their ingenuity and resourcefulness. Every part of the structure, from the framing of the walls to the placement of the hearth, was designed with careful consideration of the needs of those who lived inside. The longhouse was a testament to the Viking ability to adapt to their environment, to make use of what they had, and to thrive despite the challenges of the northern landscape. The Viking longhouse also served as a symbol of Viking identity, reflecting the values that were central to Viking culture. The design and construction of the home were informed by the community's values of strength, cooperation, and resilience. The longhouse was often the gathering place for the community, and it was within these walls that decisions were made, disputes were settled, and bonds were forged. The structure of the longhouse itself spoke to the communal nature of Viking society, with its open layout and shared spaces. The Vikings were not isolated individuals but members of a collective, and their homes reflected this interconnectedness. As the longhouse was a place of daily life, it was also a place of ritual and meaning. The Vikings were deeply spiritual people, and their connection to their homes went beyond the physical. The longhouse was often seen as a sacred space, a place where the divine and the mundane intersected. The hearth, in particular, was a focal point of religious and spiritual significance. The fire, as a symbol of both creation and destruction, was central to Viking cosmology, and the act of tending the fire was imbued with ritual importance. The hearth was not just a source of warmth, it was a place where the family and community could connect with their gods, where sacrifices were made, and where offerings were left to ensure the health and prosperity of the household. The longhouse also reflected the Viking worldview, which was shaped by their experiences of living in a harsh and unpredictable environment. The Vikings saw the world as a place of constant struggle and change, where survival depended on strength, adaptability, and cooperation. The design of their homes, with their emphasis on security, warmth, and community, was a physical manifestation of this worldview. The Viking home was not just a shelter, it was a fortress, a place where individuals and families could withstand the trials of nature and the dangers of the outside world. The Longhouse, in its simplicity and strength, symbolized the resilience of the Viking people and their ability to thrive in even the most challenging conditions. The Longhouse also served as a repository for Viking culture and history. Inside the Longhouse, the Vikings would share stories of their ancestors, of battles fought and won, of gods and heroes. The oral tradition was central to Viking culture, and it was around the hearth that these stories were passed down from one generation to the next. The Longhouse was not just a place for living, it was a place for remembering and honoring the past. The walls of the Longhouse, though silent, were steeped in the history of the people who had built them. Every carving, every decoration, every object within the Longhouse had meaning. They were all symbols of the Viking way of life, of the values and traditions that had been handed down through the generations. The Longhouse was also a symbol of the Vikings' connection to the land. The materials used in its construction, wood, stone, sod, and animal hides, were all sourced from the natural environment, reflecting the Vikings' deep relationship with the land around them. The act of building a longhouse was not just an act of construction, it was an act of symbiosis with the environment. The Vikings took what the land provided and shaped it into something functional, something that would help them survive and thrive in a world that was often unforgiving. The longhouse, in this sense, was a symbol of Viking stewardship of the land, a recognition of the importance of living in harmony with nature in order to survive. While the longhouse was a functional structure, it was also a space for personal expression and identity. The Vikings were known for their craftsmanship, and this was reflected in the decoration of their homes. Intricate carvings on beams, doors, and walls depicted scenes from Norse mythology, everyday life, and the natural world. These carvings were not just ornamental, they were a reflection of the Viking worldview. They told stories, conveyed values, and celebrated the gods, heroes, and ancestors who shaped Viking society. The decorations in the longhouse were as much a part of its identity as its physical structure. They spoke to the Viking desire to leave a legacy, to create something that would endure long after they were gone. The Viking home, therefore, was more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of resilience, culture, and identity, a reflection of the values and beliefs that defined the Viking way of life. It was a place where families could survive and thrive, where communities could come together, and where the past, present, and future were intertwined. The longhouse was the heart of Viking society, a space where the warmth of the fire, the strength of the family, and the spirit of the community all came together to create a place that was not just a home, but a symbol of the Viking people themselves. The Viking longhouse was not just a refuge from the cold and darkness of winter, it was also a fortress, built to withstand the dangers of both nature and war. For the Vikings, survival in the harsh northern climates meant adapting their shelters to protect against not only the biting cold and treacherous terrain but also the ever-present threat of conflict. Viking society, known for its warriors and raids, often lived on the edge of violence, and their homes were designed with an awareness of the constant danger that existed just beyond the horizon. The Viking longhouse, therefore, had to be a structure that could withstand the ravages of both winter and warfare, combining practicality with fortitude. The Viking world was one of constant change, where the line between peace and conflict was often blurred. The Vikings themselves were fierce warriors, and their communities were regularly engaged in battles, raids, and territorial disputes. Yet even in times of peace, the threat of attack was never far from the minds of Viking families. As a result, their shelters were designed to serve as both homes and fortresses, offering protection from the elements while also providing security from enemies. The construction of the longhouse reflected this dual need for comfort and defense. The longhouse itself was a symbol of Viking resilience, combining the wisdom of centuries of craftsmanship with an acute awareness of the realities of warfare. The design of the longhouse was shaped by the Vikings' experiences of living in a world filled with dangers, from rival tribes to invading armies. The walls were built thick and strong, often using timber, stone, or turf, materials that provided both insulation and fortification. The thick timber walls, sometimes reinforced with stone, were capable of withstanding physical impact, whether from the wind, the weight of snow, or an enemy's weapon. This thick construction also helped to insulate the longhouse against the cold, trapping heat inside and providing warmth during the long, frigid winter months. One of the most important features of the Viking longhouse was its roof, which was steeply sloped to shed snow and rain. This sloped roof not only prevented the buildup of heavy snow that could collapse a flatter roof but also provided a form of protection against attackers. A steep roof made it much harder for enemies to scale the walls of the house and gain entry from above. In a time when raids were common, the design of the roof served as a defensive measure, making the longhouse more difficult to infiltrate. The thick walls and angled roofs created a fortress-like environment that could help protect the inhabitants from external threats, whether natural or human. Beyond the physical construction of the longhouse, the way it was situated within the landscape also played a crucial role in Viking defense. The Vikings were master tacticians and understood the importance of strategic positioning. Many Viking homes were built in locations that offered natural advantages, such as elevated ground, which provided clear sight lines and made it difficult for enemies to approach unnoticed. Some homes were located near water, providing an additional layer of defense. The Viking settlements themselves were often designed as defensive strongholds, with homes grouped together in a protective perimeter, allowing the community to defend each other if necessary. The longhouses, therefore, were not isolated but part of a greater network of defense that linked the entire settlement. Inside the longhouse, the layout was also optimized for survival in times of conflict. In the event of a raid, the hearth, often located in the center of the house, became a place of refuge and defense. The hearth not only provided warmth and light but also became a gathering point for the community. In times of danger, the hearth would serve as a rallying point where the family could gather their weapons and prepare to defend themselves. The central location of the hearth allowed the fire's warmth to circulate throughout the house, while also giving the inhabitants a strong position from which to protect the house if attacked. The longhouse's open floor plan and central hearth created a sense of unity, allowing families to come together quickly when threatened. In addition to the protective design of the longhouse itself, the Vikings also relied on a variety of tools and weapons to defend their homes from invaders. Viking families were often armed with axes, swords, and shields, which were kept close at hand in case of attack. These weapons were stored near the hearth or in other accessible locations within the house, allowing the family to quickly arm themselves in the event of an attack. The Vikings were skilled warriors, and their homes were not only built for survival but also for combat. The longhouse, in this sense, was both a sanctuary and a place of readiness, where the defense of the home and family was always a priority. The construction of Viking homes was deeply influenced by the necessity of defense, but it was also informed by the harshness of the northern climate. Winter, with its long nights and freezing temperatures, was a time of extreme vulnerability. The Vikings needed their homes to protect them from the cold, but they also needed them to withstand the weight of snow, the driving winds, and the unpredictable storms. The longhouse was built with these conditions in mind, and its design was a direct response to the challenges of the environment. The thick walls and sloped roofs provided insulation, while the sturdy wooden beams and thatched or sod roofs gave the structure the strength to endure the elements. The longhouse was a place of safety, warmth, and security, allowing the Vikings to survive the brutal winter months and defend themselves from the dangers of the outside world. Yet the Viking longhouse was more than just a shelter from the storm. It was a place of continuity and resilience in the face of adversity. For the Vikings, survival was a matter of both physical endurance and mental fortitude. Their homes were not just designed to protect them from the cold or an enemy raid, they were also designed to preserve their way of life, their community, and their culture. The longhouse became a symbol of Viking endurance, a structure built to last in a world where change was constant and threats were ever present. In times of war, when the Vikings would go on raids or face off against rival clans, The longhouse served as both a sanctuary and a launching point. The Vikings, known for their seafaring skills, often built their homes near the coast, where they could quickly mobilize to defend their land or set off on a new raid. The longhouse became a central hub for both community life and military readiness. It was not just a place to sleep and eat, but a place where warriors could prepare for battle, where plans could be made, and where the defense of the home was paramount. The longhouse, in this way, was a symbol of the Viking spirit, unbreakable, adaptable, and fiercely protective. It was more than just a building. It was a reflection of the Viking way of life, one that combined strength, resourcefulness, and an unyielding commitment to survival. The Viking longhouse, with its sturdy walls, steep roof, and central hearth, was a testament to the resilience of the Viking people, who learned to endure both the brutality of winter and the dangers of war with equal determination. As the Viking Age progressed, so too did the design and purpose of their shelters. What began as simple, functional homes built for survival in harsh climates slowly evolved into more complex structures that reflected not only the Vikings' expanding territories but also their growing influence in both warfare and trade. Viking homes, which had once been rudimentary shelters, gradually transformed into fortified strongholds, designed to withstand not only the cold and unpredictable weather of the north but also the pressures of military conflict, burgeoning social hierarchies, and the demands of an expanding society. The earliest Viking homes were primarily built for utility. The longhouse, made from timber, sod, and thatch, was a basic yet effective structure designed to provide warmth and shelter for the family and their animals during the brutal northern winters. These early homes were not designed for grandeur. They were functional spaces where people could sleep, eat, and survive the harsh conditions. However, as Viking society grew more organized and the demands on their settlements increased, their homes began to evolve, taking on new features that reflected their changing way of life. One of the first major changes in Viking home design came with the rise of fortified settlements. As Viking raids expanded and the threat of attack grew, Viking homes began to take on more defensive features. The longhouses, which had once been simple and open, began to include walls made from stronger materials, including stone and thicker timbers. In areas where wood was scarce, Viking builders adapted by using local stone, creating walls that were not only more durable but also more resistant to enemy attacks. This shift in construction reflected the Vikings' growing awareness of the need for protection, as well as their ability to adapt their shelters to meet new challenges. These fortified settlements were often surrounded by ditches, palisades, or stockades, creating a perimeter of defense that could protect the inhabitants from raiders. Viking settlements, which were once scattered and isolated, became more concentrated and fortified as communities sought to protect themselves from invasions. The longhouse itself, while still central to Viking life, was no longer the only structure of importance. In many cases, multiple longhouses were grouped together within a fortified enclosure, each one offering protection and support to the others. The community now had a collective defense mechanism, where the strength of the group was enhanced by the fortifications and the shared responsibility of keeping the settlement safe. The evolution of Viking homes was not just about defense, it was also a reflection of social change. As Viking society became more stratified, the design of their homes began to reflect these new social hierarchies. In the early stages of the Viking Age, homes were relatively simple, with families living in close quarters in communal spaces. However, as Viking society evolved, so did the structure of their settlements. The rise of chieftains, kings, and other social elites led to the development of more elaborate homes, particularly for the wealthier classes. These homes were often larger and more complex, with separate rooms for different functions, such as sleeping, eating, and entertaining guests. The elite also had the resources to build homes with more durable materials, and these homes often included decorative elements, such as carvings and ornamental metalwork, that reflected their status. In contrast, the homes of the common people remained simpler and more utilitarian. These longhouses, while still made from wood and sod, began to include more specific features that were designed to accommodate the needs of an expanding population. For example, Viking longhouses began to include storage spaces, such as lofts or raised platforms, where food, tools, and weapons could be stored. This practical change allowed Viking families to store more goods and supplies, which was especially important during the long winter months when food could be scarce. In some cases, the longhouse was divided into sections with one part of the building reserved for the family and the other part for animals or other essential functions. This separation of space helped to maintain a sense of order and cleanliness within the home, even as the population grew. As Viking settlements expanded, so too did the need for more specialized structures. The Viking Age saw the construction of new buildings designed for specific purposes, such as workshops, barns, and storage sheds. These structures were built with the same attention to practicality and durability as the longhouse, but they were more specialized to meet the needs of a growing community. Workshops, for example, were built to house the blacksmiths, woodworkers, and other craftsmen who were essential to Viking society. These buildings were often located near the settlement center, making them easily accessible to everyone in the community. Another significant change in Viking home design was the increasing use of brick and stone. In some areas, particularly in the southern parts of Scandinavia, the Vikings began to use these materials for building homes and fortifications. The use of brick and stone allowed for the construction of more permanent structures that could withstand the wear and tear of time. These homes, while still incorporating many of the traditional Viking design elements, were more permanent and sturdier, reflecting the Vikings' growing wealth and influence. The most significant changes in Viking home design came with the shift from rural, isolated longhouses to urbanized settlements. As Viking society expanded, new trade routes were established, and Viking cities began to emerge. In these cities, homes were often more compact and designed for efficiency rather than the expansive, communal layouts of rural longhouses. In urban centers, homes were often built close together, with narrow streets and alleys separating them. These urban longhouses were typically made from wood and stone, and they featured smaller, more private living spaces, often with multiple floors. The central hearth remained an important feature, but these homes were now part of a larger, more organized settlement that reflected the sophistication of Viking urban life. While the Vikings' homes evolved over time, they never lost their connection to the land and the natural world. Even in their more urbanized forms, Viking homes continued to incorporate elements of nature, such as wood, stone, and thatch, reflecting the Vikings' enduring respect for their environment. The use of local materials remained a cornerstone of Viking building practices, and this connection to the natural world helped maintain the sense of harmony between the Vikings and their surroundings. In the later years of the Viking Age, as Christianity began to spread throughout Scandinavia, the design of Viking homes began to shift even further. The introduction of new religious and cultural practices influenced the way homes were constructed. Churches and chapels were built, and in some cases, these religious structures were incorporated into the layout of Viking settlements. The arrival of Christianity also led to the construction of new types of buildings, such as monasteries and cathedrals, which were often built in a European style, with stone walls and vaulted ceilings. Despite these changes, the essence of Viking home design remained rooted in the past. The longhouse, with its communal hearth and practical layout, continued to serve as the foundation of Viking life for centuries. The evolution of Viking homes from simple shelters to fortified strongholds, from rural longhouses to urban dwellings, reflects the changes in Viking society as a whole. As the Vikings grew in power, influence, and wealth, so too did the homes they built, evolving to meet the needs of an expanding and increasingly complex civilization. In the end, the story of Viking homes is one of adaptation and survival. From the early days of simple longhouses designed to withstand the cold of the north to the later, more complex strongholds and urban homes, Viking shelter design mirrored the growth and transformation of Viking society itself. These homes, built with ingenuity and resilience, continue to stand as a testament to the Viking spirit, one of innovation, strength, and a deep connection to both the land and their community. The legacy of Viking shelter design, particularly the longhouse, extends far beyond the Viking Age itself. While the Vikings' time in history was relatively short, their impact on architecture, culture, and the development of Northern Europe is still felt today. The Viking longhouse, built to withstand the harshest winters, was not only an essential part of Viking daily life, but it also left behind a rich legacy that influenced the architecture of subsequent societies. From the evolution of rural and urban homes to the adaptation of building techniques in different parts of Europe, the Viking shelter continues to echo through history. One of the most significant contributions of the Viking longhouse was its design, which was both practical and resilient. The basic structure of the longhouse, its use of timber, thatch, sod, and other locally sourced materials, served as a model for subsequent generations. In many ways, the longhouse became a standard for shelter in Northern Europe. The practicality of the longhouse's design, which included a central hearth, steeply sloped roof, and thick walls for insulation, influenced how people in colder climates would design their homes for centuries. Its ability to provide warmth and shelter during long, dark winters set the bar for what was needed in a home in harsh environments. As Viking settlements expanded and evolved, their homes became more sophisticated, but they still carried the spirit of the longhouse with them. Even in medieval towns and cities, elements of Viking architecture remained visible. The use of timber as a primary building material, the steep roofs designed to shed snow, and the emphasis on creating warm, communal spaces all echoed the longhouse's influence. In rural areas, particularly in Scandinavian countries, the longhouse's design continued to inspire the construction of farmhouses and other structures. The central hearth, often a central feature of Viking homes, remained an essential part of the design for centuries.